Hello, hi Chris. Of course, I have to do that thing now of saying that I've slightly changed my title, but here we go. I should be sharing my screen with you now. Um, if at any point the screen isn't shared or you can't hear me, just shout. And here we go. So I was originally going to bring the algorithm and technology into this presentation slightly, but as I worked on the idea of the paper, it became much more a history of madness, to borrow Louise's phrase from the chapter in her book. So this is more a history of madness, and how the history of madness and the psychiatric industry have affected the portrayal of the extremist, and how the state perceives the extremist's own experience of freedom, and that will hopefully make sense as I go through the presentation. So, how does this work? There we go. It works like this. Bear with me. I am new to Zoom. So this is the overview of Psy-Security. Traditionally, in security studies, states would portray themselves as the facilitators and protectors of liberation. And there would be a binary in how traditionally security would be portrayed, that some citizens or some people would have to be repressed to protect the freedoms of others. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to look a bit at the development of psychiatric knowledge and the psychiatric industry as opening a new terrain in the pursuit of liberation. One that attempted to restore the mad themselves to civility and to freedom. And Nicholas Rose has detailed in depth how the psychiatric industry has developed around this through technologies of the asylum, through community care, to the present day. And so this liberation struggle operates within the body of the mad, upon the psyche of the mad. Now, the point of my intervention today is to look at how those two paradigms, the security paradigm with self and other, and the psychiatric paradigm of the self's inhibited experience of freedom, how those two paradigms are coming together in the governance of extremists or dissidents. So in the 20th century, these two paradigms have merged somewhat, and dissidents and extremists are now governed not just through repressive measures to protect the freedoms of others, but their own experience of freedom is problematized and pathologized. And they are held to have an inhibited experience of autonomy that can be, of course, corrected by the state to provide security, prevent terrorism, etc. Now, at this point, it's really important that I note the work of Andrew Silk, who was key in terrorism studies to noting this persistent return to theories of psychological abnormality in order to explain terrorism. So there's a long tradition of theoretical research that terrorists must be mad, right? And he uses the Cheshire Cat logic from Alice in Wonderland to make this metaphor that you must be mad, otherwise you wouldn't be here. We're all mad here, as the cat says to Alice. But again and again, empirical studies have shown that there's no significant evidence of psychopathy or personality disorder. And yet there's this continual return to this assumption of borderline abnormality. Why does this matter? So last week, MedAct, a medical research group, released their study of the PREVENT strategy in the UK, which is a counter-radicalisation programme. And building on some work that we've done on Warwick, at Warwick, they found that people with mental health conditions are massively over-referred to the counter-extremism programme for assessment. Indeed, in the major cities in the UK, psychiatrists are embedded in counter-terrorism policing to try and help the police identify who is mad and who is bad, to divert extremists towards care if they're not, so far along the path that they've become irredeemably dangerous. And this is the current state of play. in the United Kingdom. And the purpose of talking about this is that this relies upon a liberation argument, an argument about autonomy that the state makes to use mental health professionals and psychiatry to intervene in somebody's experience and beliefs. So this is primarily undertaken through the CARE Act 2014, which was spoken about by Kate yesterday, if I remember correctly. The same CARE Act makes it possible for the state to intervene upon you if your views are considered extremist. You can be referred for your own good. Safeguarding is the rationale here. So if your views are so extreme that you might possibly be radicalizing, the state can intervene to protect you because you are clearly being abused by somebody else. Otherwise, how would these ideas get in your head? But also you might have a condition such as autism or ADHD or personality disorder. These are all named in nefarious literature as making you more vulnerable to these narratives and inhibiting your experience of autonomy. In particular, the state uses something called the Extremism Risk Guidance 22+ to analyze your risk of extremist-related violence with 22+ factors that might indicate to a professional that you pose a risk and need to be intervened upon. And these include over-identification with a group cause, a need for excitement, lovely specific indicators such as those. So this is the current state of play. And the state reforms extremists, supposedly, through de-radicalization mentoring, where you can return the subject to a liberated state, where they will no longer be preyed upon by radicalizers or obsessive thoughts. Here are some images here collected, within minutes from a Google search of the images of how radicalization gets inside the human and affects their experience of autonomy. And this autonomy can be reinstated and the extremists turn around through pastoral care. So how abusive is this? Now that we've done this long introduction about the current state of counter-extremism and freedom, how abusive is this performance of care? Well, it certainly flattens political resistance with pathology by using this idea of a care pathway to rectify and treat the extremist. Happily, though, the UK's counter-extremism programme, which is one of the largest in Europe, is also mercifully inept. So very few people are actually affected by this quite intrusive psychological kind of correction. What I want to talk to you today about is the historical comparison with this, because the story could end here, right? That extremists are corrected through psychiatric techniques to restore their experience of freedom. But the story deepens when we realize that modern Western psychiatry uses a distinction, a prominent distinction, with the political abuse of psychiatry by repressive states. And it uses this distinction to perform itself as liberatory, as the good psychiatry, right? Despite the evidence across history and critical studies of psychiatry that it's involved all the worst moments of history, right? Creating conditions for runaway slaves, applying diagnoses with huge racial bias. So I'm interested in how, while we may be suspicious of this use of psychiatry, I'm interested in the device where modern psychiatry makes itself look a lot better than the political abuse of psychiatry, which was undertaken by others. So I'm going to go into history now to look at how foundational that political abuse of psychiatry was, and its own relationship with narratives of autonomy and liberation, to show how everybody's always claiming to be the one doing the freeing, the one doing the liberation of the subject. So I need to go back to the 1920s. the most central point in all the literature on the political abuse of psychiatry, many more articles on this phenomenon than any other political abuse, goes back to Stalin's time in the Soviet Union. So there is a very surprisingly large literature in global mental health on the political abuse of psychiatry in the Soviet Union, particularly in the Brezhnev era of 70s and 80s. And at that point, there was a diagnosis of sluggish schizophrenia, which you won't find in any medical textbook anymore. But sluggish schizophrenia was an idea of a slow developing schizophrenia, which didn't have any of the hallmarks of today's definitions of schizophrenia, but rather was associated with dissidents and their refusal to participate in society productively. And it led to a lot of involuntary detentions and a very abusive practice. What is interesting here is that global mental health, and Western psychiatry in particular, has consolidated its own identity as good and as liberatory through comparison with this era of Soviet psychiatry, of political abuse, despite in some ways replaying the same activities. So the reform and the expelling of the Soviet Union from international psychiatric associations is performative here. It helps generate an identity of Western psychiatry as liberatory and helps it to paper over its own abuses. So the story could also end there, but there's another rabbit hole in that sluggish schizophrenia itself emerged as a liberatory program in the 1920s. So while it was used in the 70s to detain dissidents and democratic activists, in the 1920s, when this concept and diagnosis emerged, Bolshevik psychiatrists were fascinated again by the potential of borderline illnesses, just like all contemporary psychiatric treatments of extremism. But it associated them with the conditions of class-based oppression under Tsarism. So the psychiatrists laid the path towards the future socialist civilization, trying to complete the Psy liberation from class-based society under the Bolshevik civilization. So there was a liberation mission here, and this was the diagnosis that went along with it. So psychiatry is always trying to liberate the people from an external other, which is oppressing them. And unfortunately, limited resources and the development of the Soviet regime meant that the public health mission of the initial Soviet psychiatry was quickly pulled back. And under the intensification of Stalin's rule, suddenly psychiatrists themselves experienced intense criticism for their focus on this condition. And at this point, when the regime is beginning to be entrenched, it was no longer possible to accept the continued existence of mental illness, because socialism had been in place now for several decades. So it wasn't possible anymore to blame it on the Tsarist class-based rule that came before. Instead, to continue noticing mental illness was to say that socialism was not improving the mental condition of the Soviet population. So this becomes a problem for the regime. Such a problem that Stalin directly involves himself in psychiatric conferences in the 50s. And he directly invites, shall we say, the psychiatrists to self-criticize publicly and to admit using false diagnoses and frivolously overdiagnosing the Soviet population with mental illness. And he directs psychiatry towards new Pavlovian methods, because this is the way to obtain liberation for the socialist society. The correct psychiatry is always the path to liberation, and the conference decided under Stalin's leadership that Pavlovian methods were far superior than those Western-inspired psychiatries of old. Now, Stalin dies 2 years later, so Soviet psychiatry is left in quite a mess, having just switched from one method to another. Importantly for the talk today, Khrushchev opened space for criticism of his repressive rule. And state terror was no longer used, and state purges were used to a lesser extent against dissidents. In this liberalization compared to the Stalinist regime, psychiatric confinement became a primary method of control. And here we see the detainment of democracy protesters under Brezhnev's rule. And the diagnosis of sluggish schizophrenia returns to fame in this period as a method to explain political dissent, that these agitators have an inhibited experience of freedom, and that's why they have not accepted the socialist regime. So at all times during this story of history, psychiatry is always being reformed around the liberation of the subject, and somebody else is always to blame for the subject's oppression. And when it comes to the extremist, their own experience of freedom is compromised, and so they need to be treated rather than wiped out through violence. To bring these two eras together, why does any of this matter? Well, the writing and their protest against the abuse of psychiatry in the Soviet Union was absolutely foundational to the emergence of ethical standards documents in Western psychiatric organizations. So in their own attempt to legitimize and give a scientific foundation to this developing science, London-based dissidents organized protests and special committees to investigate basically the Soviet abuse of psychiatry, and they managed to develop the discipline of global mental health through this criticism of practices that took place in the Brezhnev era. And pressure is put on international psychiatric associations to expel the Soviet Union for posing dangers to individual liberties. And this leads to directly ethics statements of psychiatric organizations in London, across Europe. So there's a direct relationship to this othering of psychiatric practice in the Soviet Union and the development of ethical standards at home. So the two exist in a relationship to each other. They make claims about liberation by posing those claims against each other. So consolidating the identity of a global psychiatry and global mental health as caring, apolitical, and scientifically robust, it relies on this externalization of repressive others, and it helps to paper over the repressive elements of Western psychiatry itself. So there's a complicated relationship between liberation and othering here, but one which takes place inside the dissident, the body of the dissident and their psyche, and the extremist and their psyche. So I'm running up on time now. So the concluding kind of points in this tour of the history of madness are effectively that each era of psychiatry has pursued the liberation of the dissident or the extremist, but has characterized the dissident or the extremist as one whose experience of freedom is inhibited. So this is a biopolitical mandate to intervene and to correct their experience of freedom. Similarly, each era makes direct or indirect comparisons to repressive political practices that happen elsewhere. So the initial Soviet psychiatry critiqued Tsarist psychiatry and Tsarist society. Western psychiatry has developed, and its ethics standards in particular, through its critique of Soviet psychiatry. So one's own psychiatric practice as liberatory always involves a comparison to the political psychiatry that happens elsewhere. And with all of this, the traditional binary of policing and security, that you need to repress some people to liberate others, has been removed and instead plays out within the subject of Psy-Security, so within one body, always making reference to new borderline conditions. And finally, the politics of this are incredibly ambiguous in that this is a hybrid of both repression and care. using psychiatry to contain an activist, a dissident, an extremist, but also not using violence against them as once was, not wiping them out, not using the techniques that were used, say, in Northern Ireland by the British Army, or the purges of the Stalinist era. So this is very troubling, but it's also very ambiguous in that they reflect a liberalization of political attitudes towards agitators in each era, while they're also deeply troubling psychiatric practices at the same time. And I will stop there because I am out of time. Thank you very much.